Hello everyone, I'm back with another story about plants. Today we will talk about the American chestnut, its demise and resurrection. We will talk about what it used to be, what happened to it, how it and when it was reduced to its present stage, what it looks like right now, and what are the perspectives for this majestic tree? Will it ever come back to us? This prickly thing on my first slide is actually this. I can show you the real thing. Here it is. This is called the burr, and this is the very prickly fruit of American chestnut. This tree now seldom produces this fruit, and I keep this as a souvenir that I brought once from the forest where I found plenty of them. But it is a very rare occasion right now. These fruits have been lost for more than a century now. And meanwhile, this is a tree of exceptional value both for wildlife and the people of this country. Well, so it is difficult to imagine right now for us what has been lost. It is difficult to imagine what the forest at the time before the European settlement looked like in general, and especially the disastrous impact of the disease that hit this majestic tree. The disease is a fungal disease, and it's called blight, chestnut blight. So we have to, in order to appreciate the scale of this disaster, we have to first find out, understand what critical a role American chestnut played in the forest, not just for the people. It was called the redwood of the East. So before this catastrophic blight wiped out the American chestnut in the early 20th century, these were the redwoods of the East, and they dominated the forest in eastern North America. People used to say that walking into a chestnut forest would have been like walking into a cathedral. So the trees were up to 100 and even 130 feet tall and about 10 feet in diameter. And they were towering over the rest of hardwood forest here. It was a truly majestic tree. And here is the original range of the American chestnut. As you can see, it's quite vast an area, and it spreads from Maine to the Mississippi River Valley. And the chestnut constitute about 25% of hardwood forests from Maine to Mississippi. And that means that out of 4 trees was a chestnut. And at the heart of the range, that's about Tennessee and Kentucky, it was every other tree. So to give you a sense of scale, for example, in Virginia, only a single county, Patrick County, exported, according to the official record, 160,000 pounds of chestnuts in 1910. This is according to the U.S. Agricultural Census. But this must have been a low estimate because the people providing these numbers were rural folks who were a bit suspicious of the government, and so it's safe to assume there were a fair amount of unreported chestnuts in circulation. It was actually circulating money. It was equal to circulating money at that time. And meanwhile, in 1910, this blight, the chestnut blight, had already taken hold in the Northeast and was wiping out the chestnuts in the Northeast. So for these people, chestnuts were the central part of life economically, particularly for the very poor. And so when it came to the time in the fall when plenty of chestnuts were falling, it was like manna from heaven. It was almost like a community celebration. And chestnut harvests were, for example, a common place to meet your future spouse. And one woman once said that a chestnut grove is a better provider than a man, easier to get along with anyway. And also, chestnuts were nicknamed as shoe money, since children would gather nuts to buy shoes and other utensils at the beginning of the school year, whatever accessories they need for the school year. And people in these regions, especially rural, poor people, were literally living chestnut. If you were born in this region, you were placed into a chestnut cradle, and once you died, you were laid into a chestnut coffin. And chestnut wood was used for nearly everything. This photograph presents a contemporary stage. It was a dismantled, I imagine, a dismantled old barn. But as you can see, the boards are in very good, nice condition. So chestnut was not only fast growing, straight grained and lightweight, and easily worked upon. On top of all these qualities, it had very important one. As you can see, it's not subject to rot. It's very much rot resistant. And this made it excellent choice for railroad ties, fence posts, and other items that came into direct contact with soil or elements. So chestnut was a very valuable wood, not just an edible product. You could eat chestnuts even raw. You cannot eat raw acorns, for example, because they are bitter. But chestnuts uh, are good even out of the shell. Once you get rid of this prickly shell, chestnuts are immediately edible. So early on, the European settlers saw these woods, these forests, as a commodity for their use, and they did not really understand the delicate balance that the forest must maintain to stay healthy and productive and provide for all this wildlife. And actually, chestnut, in this pre-blight condition, chestnuts provided nearly 60% of food for all of wildlife in our area, from bear and deer to turkey, grouse, squirrel, chipmunks, voles, and mice. And as devastating as chestnut blight was to the people and the rural economies, the effects on wildlife were even worse. It was only later understood that this was one of the worst environmental disasters of the 20th century. literally on the planetary scale. So this, after the blight, this rural way of life, dependence on chestnut was completely wiped out and disappeared. And also, coincidentally, the Great Depression struck uh, the rural economies. So the economy, of course, rebounded and came out of this finally, but it was never the same afterwards. It changed drastically, and now people have no idea of this pre-chestnut blight life, and they totally forgot their ways, their new ways of living came over them, and they totally forgot what it was before. So chestnuts were decimated, but they are not entirely gone from the forest. So if you go to the forest nowadays, you will immediately find this uh, sharply toothed leaves, very elegant. This is how it emerges in spring. But you will never find these majestic old big trees. The chestnut leaves are very special and easy to identify in the forest. And at the end of June, they start producing these long catkins. These are flower buds, and they will develop into uh, catkins of flowers. These are chestnut inflorescences. These are male flowers. And this is the male flowers that already open, flowering catkins of chestnut. So this view was a very common view in the pre-blight forest. Everything was covered with this inflorescences. But nowadays we celebrate every mature chestnut. If we're lucky to find it, it is always a pleasure to commemorate this occasion. It's only about 10 times over the period from 2006 to nowadays that we could photograph a flowering chestnut in the wild. So you can imagine that this is a rare occasion. There is again this flowering uh, catkins in the crown of a rather big chestnut, which is quite a rare thing nowadays. And even more rare is the occurrence of these burrs. When chestnut produces nuts, it covers the entire opening around it, surroundings, with a carpet of these prickly fruits. And it's quite a scene to discover. It's very impressive when once in a while you run into a fruit in chestnut. And that only happened to me a half a dozen times in my entire pursuit of American plants. This is 20 year or a 20-year span of time. Inside, if you look inside this burst, it's quite the opposite of the outside, because inside uh, there is a layer of very soft tissue and it's very pleasant to touch. But the nuts nowadays are usually underdeveloped, or maybe it was me, I was unlucky and I never found good sized nuts. Usually what we found was not viable. You couldn't produce a seedling out of these unripe nuts because they fell off premature. But maybe squirrels and chipmunks were faster than us and took out all the good stuff, and these were just leftovers. I'm not sure. So that's the best nut they succeeded to see was like this big, and it wasn't viable at all. So this is a photograph of a young chestnut, relatively young, but it could be already maturing and producing flowers and maybe even fruits. Again, it's a very rare occasion to see a chestnut with the bark that is undamaged like that, smooth and nice, and not and free of any cankers that are manifestation of this disease. It's shiny, the bark is shiny like that, and it is covered with multiple lenticels. Well, this photograph again reiterates that we documented only about a dozen trees of this caliber in eastern Massachusetts over a long period of time. And that's what this culprit looks like. This is chestnut blight, whose Latin name is Cryphonectria parasitica. This is a type of fungus that devastates the population of our chestnuts, and it keeps devastating it because the chestnut is not completely dead, as I said. Here is how it was discovered. The first discovery of chestnut blight occurred in New York, in the Bronx Park, particularly in the zoological park, in Bronx Zoo. That's where it was discovered in 1910. But it is known now that the actual first occurrence of the disease had happened a while earlier in the 1800s, in the end of 1800s. It always takes a new invasive organism some incubation period before it accumulates enough biomass to manifest itself and become obvious to the humans. So it silently existed in the area for over 20 years before it was discovered. And after the discovery, the process of its invasion went very, very swiftly. So it was discovered in 1904, and by 1950, more than 4 billion trees were standing dead in the entire within the entire range of American chestnut. Nothing could stop the spread of the disease. There were different approaches. They tried different approaches at the time. For example, they took down all the chestnut trees in the outer perimeter in front of the advancing disease in order to make a gap and stop the further spread. But that didn't work because the disease was spreading with wind anyway, and it also took refuge with oaks, although it doesn't kill oaks, but oaks can be a host plant for this disease. So all the attempts were in vain, and this was like a fire or like a storm that spread very quickly, and it decimated this tree in its entirety, its entire large range. This is how the disease is believed to arrive to the American continent. It was imported together with the imported Japanese chestnut, Castanea crenata. As you can see, the close-up photograph looks very similar to the American chestnut. But meanwhile, Japanese chestnut is very different in another respect, because this is only a small tree the size of an apple tree, and not at all this gigantic, majestic tree like American chestnut. So uh, after the first despair moment, uh, the solution, the apparent solution that was undertaken, they decided to substitute Japanese chestnut for American chestnut. But this was, of course, very naive, because this little tree could never play the same role in the forest, in nature. Plus, it wasn't native in this country, so this idea never worked either. So, I want to deviate a little bit from our conversation into a theoretical field and familiarize you with this article that was published in 2004. This article in the Ecological Journal deals with an interesting question. How do all these invasive organisms work in the new country of their settlement? Why do they become invasive even though in their own country they are quite normal and coexist with other organisms quite peacefully? And this even refers not only to plants, but to the fungi and to animals that are introduced um, to new lands by humans and all other organisms. So it's a very general question. So the author of this article is Reagan Calloway, and the co-author is Wendy Reidnor. It's a novelty idea in the world of ecology, and so I want you to pay attention to this new concept and new explanation of why they kind of unveiled this mystery behind these invasive organisms and why they are so aggressive in their new land. So they say one of the mysteries in ecology is how exotic plants occurring at low densities in their native ranges attain extremely high densities in the introduced ranges. So, and they provide an interesting analogy here with the human history. In the 13th century, Eastern and Central Europe experienced one of the most surprising invasions in human history. The Mongols, once restricted to a small portion of Central Asia, swept into Russia, Hungary, Poland, and Germany, and consistently defeated much larger European armies. And it was only the death of the Mongol leader Odegai Khan in 1242 that prevented Europe from becoming a collection of vassal states. And the reason for that success of the Mongol invasion were complex, although it was in large part due to a brilliant strategy and discipline. These strengths were derived from the possession of a novel weapon, the recurve bow, carried by the most Mongolian soldiers. So here is the picture of this Mongolian soldier, and the bow as you can see, is recurved over here. This was a very unusual weapon, and it fired arrows faster, farther, and with greater force than anything the Europeans had ever experienced. Such novel weapons have played a role in many human invasions, but novel biological weapons have only recently been considered as possible drivers of invasions by non-human exotic species. So the authors explore the possibility that novel weapons, biochemical in nature, play a part in the exotic plant invasions that are currently sweeping the world. So the idea is that not only the natural enemies hypothesis, which is also true in part, of course, attributes exotic plant success. The natural enemies are missing in the new country. So many exotics are liberated from their specialist herbivores and pathogens. But exotics are thought to gain a substantial advantage because they have this biochemistry. In the case of our fungus, it's a biochemical weapon that it has, because American chestnuts were not adapted to this biochemical weapon that the fungus has against them. And meanwhile, the Japanese chestnuts, which evolved at the same time at the same place where the fungus lives, had adapted, and they were not killed by this weapon. So chestnut blight, as I said, reached southern Appalachia right around the time the Great Depression hit, and it was a real catastrophe. You were driving along a highway, and on both sides of that highway, all the trees were standing dead like that. It was a total surreal picture. And there was even a poem by Robert Frost. He produced this poem in 1936. It's a little clumsy, taking into consideration that this is by Robert Frost, but anyway, let's read it. Evil tendencies cancel. Will the blight end the chestnut? The farmers rather guess not. It keeps smoldering at the roots and sending up new shoots till another parasite shall come to end the blight. It's an interesting account of how the blight actually works and why in the world it never kills the chestnut tree to the very end completely. Well, the story is that the blight only affects the layer of the cells, the thin layer under the bark that is in charge of transporting water and nutrients along the stem. And so once that layer is killed, the entire tree, higher than the initial inoculation of the blight, dies. But the root system doesn't die because the fungus doesn't survive underground. And so the root system remains alive. That's what the affected trees look like. You see that the bark is looking completely different, and it's covered with these large gaping cankers. And this is a photograph of a dead tree, a dead trunk. And you see the left trunk is completely dead because the mushrooms are growing out of it, but the right trunk is still supporting alive branches and functional leaves. But it will probably survive for another year or two, and then it will be dead. And sometimes the trees like this one get to a substantial height before the fungus hits them, but it is inevitable, and sooner or later they succumb to the fungus. In our area, where chestnuts grow in rather close proximity to each other, there is no way for them to escape this infestation. That's a typical picture that you see in the forest. You see the youngest shoots are still functional and green, and then the older trunks stay in the middle and they are already dead, and usually there is a couple more even older trunks already lying dead on the ground. But the root system stays alive, and that's how it happens that it keeps sending out more and more shoots every year, but each year they become weaker and weaker. And consequently, a large number of small American chestnut trees still exist under the forest canopy, and they are sprouting from these surviving roots. Here is another example. Disregard this big tree because this big dead tree wasn't a chestnut. And what we are looking at is this shrub in the center. And you can see there are some green branches, and then there are some dead ones from last year. Then there is another trunk lying dead on the ground here, and here is yet another one, even thicker than the rest, probably the oldest one, that is already decomposing here on the ground. So usually you can find a few generations of these shoots with each American chestnut. And you can only imagine what the root system underground looks like. So it is, if you think about the destiny of this tree in the United States, it's a very difficult situation. It's like a permanent torture that this tree is subject to. It reminds of the legend about Prometheus, who was bound to the rock, and the eagle came over. It was sent to torture Prometheus and eat from his liver. And this happened to Prometheus every day. The torture seemed to be eternal, but then Heracles came and freed Prometheus. So let's think about it. Is there hope for the American chestnut? Is there any Heracles for the American chestnut in view? These are the little seedlings that were produced from the nuts at the Arnold Arboretum. So over the years, many organizations tried unsuccessfully to find a remedy against the fungus, and the effort continued for more than 50 years, but about 1960, all the attempts were abandoned and all the research came to halt. There was this hypovirulence. There was a virus that lives on chestnut blight, and it was successfully helping and used as a remedy for chestnut blight in Europe. But for some reason, it is impossible to spread this virus among chestnut trees in the United States. So if you inoculate a chestnut with this virus, it will save this particular tree, but it doesn't spread from one tree to the next. And so all the attempts to commercially introduce this virus that is called CHV1 have not been wildly successful. And again, imagine that 4 billion chestnut trees that lived in the forest of Eastern North America all were subject to the virus. So what happened to this giant, they just fell down and they lost the ability to resprout. So all of them could not resprout. They were too old. But fortunately for us, they managed to produce, before they died, they managed to produce a new crop of nuts. And these nuts produced the next generation of chestnuts. They were young, and they were also, of course, subject to chestnut blight, but differently from the mother trees, they were capable of resprouting. And that's what we're dealing with right now. They keep resprouting. But as you can see, this Forest Service worker is planting new chestnuts still. So finally, it was realized that all the efforts should be rechanneled. Instead of finding a cure for chestnuts, let's help American chestnut develop resistance similar to the one that Asian chestnut possess. So the American Chestnut Foundation was started. And what they did, they decided to work on this traditional approach by crossing female Chinese chestnut, which also, like Japanese chestnut, has resistance, with the American pollen of American chestnut. And they produced this Chinese-American hybrid. But that's not the end of the story. This Chinese-American hybrid is 50% American, but 50% Chinese. And so they made a back cross. They took this hybrid and game crossed it with American pollen, and that increased the Americanness of the produced trees. Then they grew the second generation for 5 years, inoculated with blight these new young trees, and selected resistant plants from them. And then they used these resistant plants for future crosses and produced 2 more generations of back crosses and selected the most resistant ones from those. And so they killed a lot of those seedlings by inoculating them with the blight. But very few of them survived, and they used those for future selection. So blight resistance theoretically is going to grow along with the percentage of American genes. The American Chestnut Foundation was established in 1985, and their mission was to carry this slow, diligent work. And then in the 1990s, the entire countrywide system of breeding and seed production of this orchard of chestnuts was structured all across the United States. So the American Chestnut Foundation now has chapters in every state. And these chapters were supposed to incorporate genetic diversity over the entire geographic range of American chestnut to be able to represent its genetic diversity across the Eastern North America. and to capture all the variation that exists in the wild. So this is one of the 6 orchards that Massachusetts and Rhode Island chapter is um, owning right now. And then there are a few healthy chestnuts, quite of large caliber, were discovered in northern New York. They were isolated from the rest of the chestnut population and miraculously survived and attained quite large size. And that's how the American Chestnut Foundation of New York was established. That's yet another organization that is contributing to the genetic work on the chestnut. And then finally, another player came into this game. It's in this, again, in New York, the State University of New York, in the College of Environmental Science and Forestry. There is this professor, Dr. Powell, whose entire life is dedicated to the rescue of the American chestnut. But Professor Powell has a very different approach. Instead of doing this traditional hybridization work, they used the advancement of molecular biology and produced a genetically modified American chestnut. They decided that they take the American chestnut, which is completely American without any Chinese or Japanese genetics, and only install a single gene into it that will enable this chestnut to fight the disease the way the Japanese and Chinese chestnuts do. But I want you to listen to Dr. Powell himself and how he explains this different approach of his. But I want to explain that these two approaches are kind of juxtaposed, and right now there is no unity in the scientific community of what is going to be done with the chestnut finally. A while ago, leaders of the American Chestnut Foundation concluded that they could not achieve their goals through just crossbreeding alone and embraced Dr. Powell's genetic engineering program. And this decision has caused a significant rift in the American Chestnut Foundation. For example, in 2019, the president of the Massachusetts Rhode Island chapter here resigned, citing arguments made by the Global Justice Ecology Project. This is an anti-genetic engineering organization based in Buffalo. And so this organization believes that genetically modified organism in the forest would be a Trojan horse that clears the way for other commercially grown genetically modified trees. And once they are released in the forest and not controlled, this is going to be a very dangerous precedent for the nature of the United States. But let me introduce Dr. Powell himself, and you will hear from him directly. And he's talking on this TEDx Talks. This is, you are very much familiar with TED Talks at this point, but TEDx Talks is an independently organized event. It's only in the spirit of TED Talks, but it's a program of local self-organized events that bring people together to share conversation in this TED-like atmosphere, but it's not TED Talks proper. So it's a similar event. Let me give stage to Dr. Powell himself.
I'd like you to first think about, when is the last time you saw an American chestnut tree? Now you're probably thinking, well, I haven't seen an American chestnut tree. And that is actually a sad and true story. Only some of our most senior people have actually seen American chestnut trees the way they used to be. They used to be one of the most abundant trees in the eastern forests. So if you were to look at this scene behind me of a patch of the Appalachian Mountains, 1 out of 4 trees would have been American chestnut in this setting. Okay, quite a few trees. Now, the American chestnut was a keystone species, meaning that a lot of other animals and wildlife relied on it for their survival. One of the main reasons why it was a keystone species is because of the mast or the nut crop that it produced year after year. It produced a very, very stable nut crop. The oak trees, which has since replaced the chestnut, do not produce that consistent, stable mast as the chestnut did. Now you're thinking nuts, well, maybe that supports things like squirrels. Well, it did support squirrels. In fact, when we lost the chestnut, the actual squirrel populations in the forest declined. Okay, but a lot of other animals also relied on chestnut, and all these that I'm showing here. Even some animals that are now extinct that you're hearing about in these talks today, such as the Carolina parakeet. And of course, since everybody else has mentioned it, I'm going to mention the passenger pigeon also. It probably relied on American chestnut. So you think about it, if you're going to bring back a species such as the passenger pigeon, what are you bringing it back to? Well, our forests are not the same as they used to be. They used to be predominantly chestnut. So you might want to first bring back the chestnut before you bring back these other species. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do at this first part of my talk is to convince you that chestnut is a species worthy of restoration. And I've just shown you right here how important it is to the ecology, and it has many other values also. The American chestnut was also very valuable as a nut crop for agriculture. Not only did wildlife like to eat chestnuts, but humans like to eat chestnuts also. Whether you like to eat it roasted or candied or ground it up into a flour where you can make soups or breads, or you can even brew it into beer. And by the way, this is a gluten-free beer for those of you who are like me who can't eat gluten. Okay, so it had a lot of value in that way. It also is very valuable for the wood that it produced. The wood was very straight-grained. This was a fast-growing tree, so woodworkers liked it. But one of the key things about it was that it was a very rot-resistant wood. And so it could be used in outdoors without rotting. So what I always tell people is if chestnut was abundant, like it was in the past, all your decks would be made out of chestnut instead of that old pressure-treated stuff that it's made out of now. In fact, all telephone poles would probably be made out of chestnut, and you wouldn't have to treat them with all kinds of chemicals. Okay, so it has a very good economic value. But in addition to that, the American chestnut tree is really part of our history and part of our heritage. Okay? You probably can't go to a town without finding a chestnut street. Just like you would find an elm street or a maple street, you always find a chestnut street. I particularly like this corner here, the intersection of Chestnut and Powell, for obvious reasons. But this is actually in California. This is way out of the range of the American chestnut, yet is still recognized. You've probably seen chestnut mentioned in songs, such as this very familiar song at Christmas time, and it starts off, "Chestnuts roasting on the open fire." You might have learned this poem in school at some point, where it talks about, "Under the spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands." That is also an American chestnut. So it's really kind of part of our natural heritage here in the United States. Now, the American chestnut was one of the largest trees in the eastern forest before we lost it. This is a picture from the Forest Historical Society showing some lumberjacks in a stand of large chestnuts, and you can see how large they are. This next picture is not actually a photograph, it's a painting, and so it's taking a picture of a painting, but I kind of like this because it shows a different form of the chestnut. If you grow this in the open, it actually spreads like that last poem. And this one is showing a chestnut harvest, and to kind of give you an idea of how big these trees will get, there's a guy up there knocking chestnut down to the people below. So these trees got quite large. Why don't we have chestnuts today? Well, we don't have them, again, because of what humans have done. We have introduced an exotic pathogen from Asia when people were start importing Asian chestnuts to plant in their yards or in their orchards to have a close by supply of nuts. When we brought that over, a fungus that causes chestnut blight moved over with it. Now this fungus is called Cryphonectria parasitica, and it was very happy to come to the United States, as you can see here. This is a real plate of the fungus, believe it or not. So it came here, found a host that was totally susceptible to it, and it jumped onto the American chestnut, and within 50 years, spread through the whole range of the chestnut from down south in Georgia to up north into Maine. Okay, and it killed somewhere between 3 to 5 billion chestnut trees. Okay, very, very damaging. Now, when this was happening, people were panicking, of course. Could you imagine driving down the highway and seeing the largest trees on the side of the road all dead? At least half of them to a quarter of them were all just standing up dead. This is what people were seeing. So they threw a lot of resources at trying to stop the chestnut blight, but everything failed. And we basically lost the chestnut tree, at least the mature large trees. Chestnut is still surviving today at the roots. So it's not extinct, it's just functionally extinct. Okay, so right now there's actually 2 programs that are having some success at making a blight-resistant American chestnut tree. There are breeding programs and there's a transgenic program. I am involved with the transgenic program. And I'm going to kind of do a quick comparison of the 2. Each of them are viable programs, and each of them probably will have some levels of success. They each have their own pros and cons, though. So the breeding program, what they're doing is they're crossing American chestnut to Chinese species of chestnut that are naturally resistant to blight, because that's where the blight comes from. And then they back cross to American to try to regain all the American traits. Okay? When they do this, they end up with a tree that's 1/16 Chinese and, of course, 15/16 American, which sounds really good, and it is pretty good. But I want to do a little illustration for you. Let's think of the chestnut and chestnut genome as a book, okay? And let's say that book is filled with words, and the words represent the genes in the chestnut, okay? We know about how many genes are in chestnut, and they would fill about a 180-page book. So if you're 1/16 Chinese, what that means, about 11 pages or close to 3,000 words in that book are from Chinese. Okay, or in Chinese. Now that might not be important because we have a lot of duplicate genes in the 2, but it might be important if this is a critical plot line or something like that. And the reason why it's important with Chinese and American chestnut is because Chinese chestnut has actually been bred for thousands of years as an orchard tree. American chestnut is a wild timber type tree. And there's a lot of traits that we don't want from the Chinese chestnut. So the problem here is you got to then breed out all those traits you don't want. All right, that can be done. It just takes a lot of work, a lot of selection. Let's look at what you do with transgenics. Now, let's follow up that book analogy. I'm going to take one passage out of that book, or one sentence. It's actually a sentence from Thoreau's Walden. I kind of like that because he really likes chestnuts in that. And I'm going to use that as an example. We can put in just a few genes at a time using a natural genetic engineer called Agrobacterium tumefaciens. This is a bacteria that in the wild moves genes around in plants. So what scientists have done is basically tamed this bacteria so it moves genes in that we want to move in. So what we're doing is we're only moving 2 to 4 genes into the tree. So we're not making a big change. We're making a very small change to the tree. And now we don't have to go back and try to get rid of genes that we put in there that we don't really want. Okay, so that's an advantage with transgenics. So where do we get these genes from? Well, we can get them from the same place we get the genes for the breeding program. We can get them from Chinese chestnut species, and we actually are looking at genes from those species. Some from Castanea mollissima, some from Castanea seguinii. But another powerful thing about transgenics is you can move genes actually from other plants. And I'm going to give you an example of one of those that have given us some success this summer. And that is a gene that comes from wheat. And we like this because this is a gene that you normally eat all the time anyway in the gene product, so it's generally safe. But more importantly is that the way this gene works, it detoxifies the acid that the fungus uses to attack the tree. We know that this fungus, the only way it can form a canker and kill a tree is to throw oxalic acid at it. If you can remove that, it can no longer form a canker. All right? So what we're basically doing is giving the tree an ability to defend itself against the fungus. The tree is not killing the fungus, it's only defending itself against the fungus. Okay? Now, I want to show you some of our exciting results from this past summer. This is an experiment where we are measuring the size of the canker growth on some American chestnut trees, Chinese chestnut trees, and some of our transgenic ones. This first line represents the growth on an American chestnut tree. The higher that line goes, the bigger the canker, and eventually will girdle the branch, killing everything above it. So that's American chestnut, very susceptible. If you look at Chinese chestnut, it has a much smaller canker. We call this a superficial canker. Does not kill the branch. Right? Let's look at our transgenic American chestnut that has the oxalate oxidase gene. And what's exciting here is it's tracking along with the Chinese chestnut. So we've definitely shown that we can enhance blight resistance using these methods and with this particular gene. Now we're going to do this again this coming summer because you always have to repeat things in science, but things are looking very good. So let's look at what we have right now. We have American chestnut, which is very susceptible on your left. We have Chinese chestnut, which is more resistant on your right. This tree that I just showed you, called the Darling 4 tree, is approaching the level of resistance of the Chinese chestnut. Now, what's really exciting is we have some new trees that's coming out of our lab right now for the summer. And these trees make more of this enzyme that detoxifies the acid. Okay? And what we're finding in our preliminary tests, we think these might even be more resistant than the Chinese chestnut. And so this is very exciting for us. Again, we have to test them in the field, which we will be doing over the next few years. Okay, so what do you do once you have a resistant chestnut tree? Okay, one thing, when we make these, we only make a few of them. So they're not going to be very diverse. So we have to try to increase the genetic diversity of these before we put them in a restoration program. And we do that by going to the surviving trees in the field and cross them with our transgenic tree. And we just developed a new method that allows us to produce pollen from either seedlings or from plantlets in less than a year. Typically in the field, it takes 3 to 7 years to get pollen. Okay, so we have a method now that we can get pollen in 1 year, and next year get another group of pollen, and we can outcross it until we get a very diverse group of trees. We've actually done this. We've actually produced nuts from these crosses. These nuts have inherited the gene that we put in, which is an important point. And we also now have nuts that we are sending away to some of our colleagues at Oak Ridge Natural Lab to check to make sure the nuts aren't any different than the wild-type nuts, and that's important also. Okay, so what do we do next from there? Well, to start a restoration program, one of the cons of using transgenics is that these things are highly regulated. They're regulated by 3 agencies, the USDA, the EPA, and the FDA. So before we can just release a tree to anybody, we have to get their approval. But once we get their approval, then we can treat it like any other tree and start a restoration program. So, how do we get into a restoration program? Well, the range of the American chestnut is large. There used to be a lot of trees there. You don't just go out like Johnny Appleseed and spread them around. So what I like to think of it as restoration has to start at what I like to call restoration foci. These are small areas where you can start to establish a group of trees, and then slowly they'll move out from there. This can be on historic sites if you want to try to restore a historic site to what it looked like 100 years ago. It could be on private landowners. But what I really like is restoration of mine lands. There's a lot of places in the Appalachia where they mine coal, the mines are done, and they want to return those to the forest. These are very good places to start restoration using chestnut because there's no trees there to start with. And we don't want to cut down trees that are already there. Now, where do you go from that point? Well, the next point is really gets out of our hands and goes into your hands, okay? This is where the people do the restoration. This is a century-long project. So we need you, and we need you to help with this, okay? We need you and your children and your grandchildren to bring these trees back, because it's going to take a long time to get back to the over 1 billion trees in the forest. So if you're interested in helping with restoration, you can contact the American Chestnut Foundation. I got the website here, and they are always looking for help. So I want to stop there and give thanks to the many colleagues who helped us get to this point in the research. I didn't do this all myself. It was on the backs of many, many researchers. I'd like to thank you for coming here and just recognize all the supporters over the years. Thank you.
And now, once you are familiarized with the point of view of Dr. Pavel, let me show you a little cartoon that presents the same idea in a nutshell, but in a very straightforward way, so every one of us understands the idea of Dr. Powell and how it all works. It will only take 3 minutes to watch.
The American chestnut was once one of the most important trees in the eastern U.S. It provided food and habitat for everything from bees to bears. And for people, it was used as an annual nut crop and a straight-grained, rot-resistant wood. In some areas, farmers realized more income from the sale of chestnuts than all other farm products. Then, in the late 1800s, a fungal blight entered the U.S. through the port of New York on imported Asian chestnut trees. And over the next 50 years, it killed over 3 billion American chestnut trees and significantly changed the lives of people and wildlife. After a century of unsuccessful attempts to fight the blight, researchers from the American Chestnut Research and Restoration Project discovered a simple solution with the help of biotechnology. Here's how it works. The chestnut blight fungus colonizes wounds in the tree and then produces oxalic acid, a toxin that kills the tree's cells. The fungus, which eats the dead tissue, spreads and forms cankers that eventually girdle the tree. Circulation is cut off, and everything above the canker dies. Other plant pathogens also use oxalic acid to attack their host plants, so many plant species have evolved a mechanism to protect themselves from this acid. One such defense gene produces an enzyme called oxalate oxidase, which removes the acid without harming the pathogen. This gene is used by many plants, including wheat, bananas, and strawberries. We have been able to make blight-tolerant American chestnut trees by transferring an oxalate oxidase gene from wheat into the chestnut's genome. This enzyme protects the tree from the acid by transforming it into harmless compounds. By removing the weapon of the fungus, the tree and the fungus can now coexist. Because it is a very small change, and the American chestnut tree retains all of its original genes, the tree is still fully adapted to its habitat. Our blight-tolerant American chestnut trees can potentially be used to rescue the remnant population of American chestnuts currently surviving mainly as stump sprouts. Pending federal approval, the blight-tolerant trees can be outcrossed to these surviving mother trees. Continued outcrossing could produce a diverse and blight-tolerant population fully adapted to our forests. Just as the blight originally spread outward from New York State, so can its remedy, the blight-tolerant American chestnut trees. With help from our collaborators, the American Chestnut Foundation, and others, we can extend the restoration efforts throughout the American chestnut's range to help restore this magnificent tree and improve the health of our eastern forests. To learn more about ESF, American Chestnut Research and Restoration Project, please visit www.esf.edu/chestnut. If you want to help with the restoration, join your local state chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation at www.acf.org.
And finally, TEDx Talks. The management probably decided that they also have to hear the other side of the conversation and gave stage for someone who is working towards the resurrection of American chestnut in the traditional way. This is the professor of biology at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, Department of Biological and Environmental Sciences, Dr. Hill Craddock. He grew up, by the way, in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, and he is a son of a marine biologist and an emergency room nurse. So let him talk and explain his understanding of the work on American chestnut and how it should be organized.
The first chestnut tree I ever saw, I grew from a seed I planted myself when I was about 15 years old. I got the seeds from a neighbor of mine, John Todd, of the New Alchemy Institute in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. He told me they were American chestnuts. I think he got them from Dick Janes at the Connecticut Agriculture Experiment Station. I planted the seeds in flower pots in a little lean-to greenhouse that my father had built. And when the seedlings were about a year old, we transplanted them to a nursery bed in John's front yard. From the nursery, most of them were planted at the New Alchemy farm in Hatchville. But one of those trees I set out in my front yard, where it is still growing today. When my chestnut tree was about a year old, I read Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture by J. Russell Smith. The book made a lot of sense to me. At the time, this was the late 1970s. Some of you remember the 1970s. I was concerned about the end of oil and overpopulation and world hunger. And Tree Crops made a lot of sense to me. It offered practical examples of real solutions to many of the problems of agriculture, soil erosion, the use of pesticides, toxic pesticides, the loss of biological diversity. On sloping and mountainous lands, nut-bearing trees and other woody crops may be the only sustainable solutions to producing food. Of all the tree crops that were discussed by Smith, the chestnut tree was by far the most interesting to me. I was particularly moved by his description of the thousands of years old chestnut groves in Italy and the island of Corsica, a veritable chestnut civilization. It may be exaggeration to claim that the chestnut tree, the European chestnut, is one of the columns upon which Western civilization is built, but it certainly ranks right up there with the grapevine and the olive tree as Mediterranean staples. It was during the 7 years that I lived in Italy that I had many of my most significant chestnut experiences. Talking to the Italians, learning about their chestnut trees, about their shared memories of the chestnut forests, about recipes, about famine during the war, and how at the end of the war, all they had left was the chestnut tree. Became to appreciate the cultural and historical values, the personal values, and the intrinsic values that this tree represents to the peoples of Italy. And I came to appreciate the enormity of the tragedy that would befall the earth if this heritage were lost. Agriculture causes environmental degradation, especially when it depends on the plow to plant annual crops. It causes soil erosion. It leads to biological diversity. Cropping systems based on perennial plants may mitigate those negative ecological impacts by allowing soil building processes to flourish. The chestnut tree comes very close to representing the archetypal tree crop. They're very long-lived. Examples of Castanea sativa in Italy are known to be more than 1,000 years old. They produce annual crops of delicious, nutritious nuts that are easily harvested and easily stored. Chestnuts coppice well. They sprout back tremendously when they're cut, and they can be managed on 15 to 20-year rotations. The standards can be left for 2 or 3 cycles for larger saw timbers. The tree provides wood for fuel, for poles, for lumber, for tannin extraction, for leather tanning. Because a mature chestnut orchard resembles a temperate hardwood forest in both structure and function, it offers environmental, ecological benefits far beyond merely producing a nut. It offers habitat for myriad animal species. It acts as a keystone in its community. It anchors the soil to steep slopes that might otherwise be completely unsuitable for any other form of agriculture. It intercepts rainfall and moderates the local climate by shading the understory and transpiring water into the atmosphere. It serves as a host for the mutualistic symbiotic relationships with fungi, including the choice edible chanterelles and porcini mushrooms, whose niches are those of the great recyclers and decomposers in the soil, mobilizing minerals and nutrients into the humus layer. The landscape value of the chestnut may be unequaled by that of almost any other forest type, possibly because the grove itself is evocative of a simpler, quieter past when our relationship to nature was based on the regular cycles of sun and moon and season. The American chestnut was the largest of all the chestnut species. In East Tennessee and western North Carolina, where it reached its greatest proportions, the canopy of the chestnut forest was well over 100 feet from the ground. It was one of the fastest growing trees, keeping pace with tulip poplar and easily outgrowing the oaks on most sites. It covered an enormous area from the uplands of Alabama and Georgia throughout Appalachia into Canada and New England. There were more uses for American chestnut than for any other kind of tree. Its sheer abundance was unrivaled by any other one kind of tree. European settlers described vast areas covered by pure stands of chestnut forest. The annual harvest, the annual production of the American chestnuts supported entire communities of wildlife and game animals and local economies. All that came to an end in 1904 with the discovery of the chestnut blight. The 20th century was very hard on chestnut, particularly in North America, but also in Europe. Conspiracy of circumstances, the catastrophic diseases, 2 world wars, changing diets, cultural revolutions, the almost insane economics of the global village contributed to the almost total extinction of the American chestnut, total loss of the American chestnut, and the almost near extinction of the chestnut civilization worldwide. The blight, chestnut blight, is caused by a fungus, an orange mold. It literally eats the bark of the tree. Necrotic lesions quickly girdle the tree and kill it. Within 50 years of the discovery in the Bronx, in New York City, of chestnut blight, the pandemic had completely removed the American chestnut from its ecological niche as a forest canopy dominant tree. It may be difficult for us today to comprehend the scale and the scope of this destruction. In fact, there is no other example in the history of forest pathology where an introduced pathogen so quickly and completely removed its native host. It was a true pandemic. There were no unaffected individuals. But chestnut trees are not extinct. The American chestnut is not extinct because the fungus only kills the bark, but not the roots. They continue to sprout from the base. In fact, throughout much of the eastern woodlands, we can still find chestnuts. They rarely grow large enough to flower and produce a seed, but they may still be there. The situation in Europe was very similar to the American experience. The consequences, though, were less severe because of the discovery of a natural biological control for chestnut blight called hypovirulence. It's based on a virus The virus attacks the fungus and keeps the fungus from killing the tree. Remember, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the virus attacks the fungus. The biocontrol has not worked as well in North America. We have not seen the landscape scale changes in the United States that we've seen in Europe, but it does work well in some locations and on some individuals, on individual trees. I am working with a group of citizen scientists to restore the American chestnut. We've organized ourselves into state chapters of the American Chestnut Foundation. Primarily, we are plant breeders. We use classical plant breeding techniques. Our goal is to breed for resistance to chestnut blight and to Phytophthora root rot, another disease, based on the genes for disease resistance found in the Asian species. The disease-resistant hybrids must be able to survive and reproduce on their own in the forest. We use repeated back crosses to the American species to dilute out the Asian portion of the hybrid genome, selecting at each generation only those individuals that combine the desired blight resistance with the American form. The seeds are grown in the greenhouse, some of them. When the weather settles, we can move those outside. We can establish new experimental orchards by the direct seed method, planting the seeds in their permanent orchard locations, or by transplanting seedlings, container-grown seedlings like these. When the trees, after 4 or 5 years of tender, loving care, the trees are ready for screening. The screening is rigorous and ruthless. Screening is a euphemism for killing trees. We give each tree a potentially lethal dose of the chestnut blight fungus. Susceptible trees die very quickly. Resistant trees form a callus that begins to wall off the canker, and they begin to heal. Within a few years, the cankers on the most resistant trees are completely healed. Most of the trees must die, though. The value of those few remaining trees is great. Only those individuals, only the very best individuals, are advanced to the next generation. We are currently testing, for the first time in history, in cooperation with private landowners and the U.S. Forest Service, blight-resistant American chestnut trees that are between 94 and 97% American. Meanwhile, in the laboratory, we've worked out the genome sequences of the chestnut tree and the fungus that causes the blight, and the virus responsible for hypovirulence. Chestnut trees are being planted once again all over the world, in the areas where chestnuts have been grown traditionally, and in places where chestnut growing has only been recently introduced. Advances in plant breeding and molecular biology promise us disease-resistant chestnuts. I am very optimistic about the return of the American chestnut. I'm confident that future generations will be able to enjoy this magnificent tree once again. But ecological restoration is a very ambitious goal. The work is multidisciplinary. The scale and the scope of this project is very long-term. The pedigrees of my most recent hybrids date back to the 1930s and 1940s to crosses made by Russell Clapper and Arthur Graves at Glendale and New Haven. Our strategic vision includes experiments that are planned for 100 years of observation. Chestnuts they can be, a part of a healthy diet, a healthy agriculture, and a healthy forest. I'd like to end with a poem by the American poet Robert Frost. It was first published in 1936 during the darkest days of the chestnut blight pandemic, and 30 years before the discovery of hypovirulence. Evil tendencies cancel. Will the blight end the chestnut? The farmers rather guess not. It keeps smoldering at the roots and sending up new shoots until another parasite shall come to end the blight. Thank you.
So there is no right or wrong answer, as you can see from these conversations. The contemporary point of view is still undecided. These both TEDx talks took place a while ago, actually. One in 2013 and the other 2014. And I was trying to figure out what is the last word in this conversation and which direction the USDA and other environmental agencies in the United States are going to go. But there is still no answer to that. And this is the question, this dilemma is still in the air. And you have to make your own mind and see what you think about this and which direction is more productive and will bring the American chestnut to the United States. But I cannot answer this question at this point because it's hard to make this informed decision even for me. So I have to wrap up this conversation and just let you know that I'm undecided myself on this. What do you think? I wonder. Let's discuss this later.